I walked through the devastated streets, where each step echoed a past full of lives that no longer existed there. The landscape was a symphony of ruins, crumbled buildings, charred vehicles, and the constant smell of gunpowder and death. The city, once vibrant, was now an open-air cemetery, where fear and desolation reigned supreme. Looking around, it was impossible to ignore the distant screams, the whispers of panic, and the cries of the few survivors who, like me, wandered in search of some meaning. In the midst of this chaos, I found Ryan. He was just a boy, but his eyes carried the weight of 1,000 battles. His hands trembled as he held the gun, the same one he had used to take lives he didn't even understand why they were enemies. His confusion was almost palpable, a young recruit forced to fight for an ideal lost in the fog of war. Then there was Maria. I met her in one of the few makeshift hospitals still functioning. She ran from bed to bed, trying to save those who still had a chance, indifferent to the symbol they bore. Her hands were always stained with blood, but it was her empty, almost insane look that scared me. Maria desperately tried to keep her sanity amid the horror, healing the wounded on both sides as if pain had no flag. And then there was Ahmed. A rebel leader, his presence was a mix of authority and despair. He spoke fervently about the cause, but there was something in his voice that betrayed his true emotions. Each day of violence only fed his doubts, and I could see his faith in the fight slowly crumbling. Ahmed was trapped between the fervor of his followers and the growing realization that the freedom he fought for might not be the solution, but part of the problem. When this war began, there was a cause. Or at least, that's what they said. The stories varied: a fight for freedom, a revolution against tyranny, a battle for justice. But as the years dragged on, the truth got lost in a web of lies and misinformation. Now, it was hard to tell who the real enemy was. Each faction had its own version of the story, and the population, crushed in the middle, just wanted to survive another day. Uncertainty hung in the air, a constant ghost that fueled paranoia and the instinct to kill first and ask questions later. I, lost in this sea of horror and despair, was just trying to understand how we got to this point. How the original reason for so much bloodshed dissolved, leaving behind only a scene of destruction, fear, and desolation.
Every dawn on the battlefield was a game of Russian roulette. The roar of gunfire and the whistling of bullets created a macabre melody that made me wonder if that day would be my last. I walked among the bodies of my comrades and enemies, but by now, it made no difference. Everything blended into a blur of blood and mud. Each life I took weighed heavily on my soul, a burden I didn't know how to carry. The ideology they told me I was fighting for was a vague shadow, an ideal that made no sense amid so much horror. I wanted to believe, to find some purpose, but confusion cloaked me like a mantle, and more, I wondered if there really was a right side in this war.
In the makeshift hospital, time seemed frozen in an endless nightmare. Each day brought new wounded, new stories of pain and despair. I ran from bed to bed, my hands always stained with blood, trying to save lives regardless of who they were or where they came from. Soldiers from both sides screamed in pain, begging for help, and I refused to see the colors of their flags. Their humanity was my only concern. Every decision was an ethical dilemma, a constant risk. Sometimes I had to choose who would live and who would die, and that responsibility gnawed at my sanity. But amid all the chaos, I knew my mission was to keep the spark of compassion alive, even if it meant sacrificing a piece of myself every day.
I watched my men, young and full of hope and fury, ready to die for the cause I had preached. But inside me, Doubts grew like weeds, choking the faith I once had. Every decision I made, every order I gave to attack, made me question if we were truly fighting for the future I had dreamed of. The violence intensified, and the brutal actions I was forced to take weighed on my conscience. It was a vicious cycle. To maintain leadership, I had to show strength and conviction, but every day, it felt like we were only feeding the monster of war. The freedom we longed for seemed more and more like a distant dream, and I began to fear that we had become part of the problem we were trying to solve. The sound of the bombings grew closer each day, and the front lines seemed to be everywhere. One morning, we woke up to the news that the neighboring village had been massacred. They said it was a preemptive strike, but no one knew for sure who had started it. Panic and paranoia gripped everyone. Our patrols increased, and the tension was palpable. I constantly felt watched, waiting for the next shot, the next alarm. The nights were the worst, with surprise attacks forcing us to fight in the dark, not knowing against whom or why. Every shadow was a threat, every noise a harbinger of death. Amid this madness, the line between friend and foe began to blur. I saw comrades turn against each other, suspecting betrayal. One day, during an ambush, a soldier on our side shot me, thinking I was an infiltrator. The confusion and fear were so great that we no longer trusted even ourselves. Ryan, my trench mate, looked at me with growing suspicion. Maria, in the hospital, began to hesitate to treat certain wounded, questioning if she was saving lives or just delaying the next wave of violence. And Ahmed, the rebel leader, seemed increasingly lost, his voice once full of fervor now laden with uncertainty. Then came the decisions that would change everything. Ryan, during a patrol, encountered a group of enemy soldiers, including a young boy who could barely be older than him. The boy was wounded and unarmed, begging for mercy. Ryan had to choose between finishing him off or taking him prisoner, risking being considered a traitor by his own men. Maria, facing a room full of wounded, had to choose who would have a chance to live with the few remaining supplies. One of the wounded was an enemy commander, vital to Ahmed's plan. Saving that man meant sacrificing one of her own, someone she had fought alongside. Ahmed, seeing his forces divided and morale shattered, decided to launch a suicide attack to try to turn the tide. He knew this meant sending many of his men to certain death, including some of his closest friends, but the alternative was to watch his movement collapse completely. These decisions changed us. Ryan, after sparing the young soldier, was confronted and beaten by his own men, but he kept his humanity intact. Maria, by saving the enemy commander, was seen as a traitor by some but also as a beacon of hope by others. Ahmed, leading the attack, lost many men but regained a glimpse of his old faith, seeing the resilience and courage of his followers. Every choice we made defined us, in a world where morality was distorted and beliefs were tested to the limit. The war continued, relentless, but inside us, something had changed forever. I knew the confrontation was inevitable. The tension between Ryan, Maria, and me was reaching a breaking point, and it was only a matter of time before our paths would cross violently. The final battle began at dusk, as the sun barely touched the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that only heightened the terror. Amid the chaos, I found Ryan in an advanced position, his face covered in dirt and sweat. The fear in his eyes was mixed with a desperate resolve. He saw me before I could hide, and I saw his finger hesitate on the trigger. I shouted at him, trying to be heard over the constant gunfire. What should have been a simple clash of factions quickly turned into a personal confrontation. I had known Ryan since the early days, when he was just a kid, and now we were on the verge of killing each other. The fight was brutal and close. Each blow and shot seemed to carry a decade of resentment and despair. In the heat of combat, I couldn't tell if I was fighting a friend or an enemy, but the truth was that we were both victims of the same horror. When the attack finally ceased, I stood over a field of bodies, feeling the weight of the lost lives crushing my shoulders. As the dust settled, Maria emerged from the rubble, her expression a mix of exhaustion and terror. She had come to the battlefield with an unshakable determination to save whatever she could, but now, reality had proven cruel and relentless. With a scream of horror, she showed me a document she had found in the hands of a fallen soldier, a report revealing the truth about the conflict. I discovered that the war, which had seemed endless and justified, had been manipulated from the start by corrupt leaders on both sides to maintain their own power. The revelation was a punch to the gut. Everything we had fought for, all the lives lost, were the result of lies and personal agendas. Ryan, who was beside me, dropped to his knees, his belief in the cause crumbling under the weight of the truth. Maria, with tears in her eyes, looked at us, her efforts feeling utterly futile. What we had done, what we had allowed to happen, was even more terrifying than any battle. The desolation after the revelation was palpable. The battlefield, now a scene of destruction and bodies, seemed to reflect our devastated souls. Ryan, lost in his own confusion, walked away, his mind surrounded by a cloud of uncertainty and despair. The idea that his actions had no purpose consumed him, and he collapsed to the ground in a state of emotional paralysis. Maria, with her mission to help, saw everything she had tried to save crumble before her eyes. She sat amidst the wreckage, enveloped in deep sadness, tears flowing freely. The pain of knowing that her efforts to preserve life had been in vain was unbearable. And I, despite surviving the confrontation, was overwhelmed by guilt and despair. The battle was over, but the war inside me was an endless fight. I felt like we were all trapped in an endless nightmare, a reality where hope had evaporated, and the struggle for truth and justice seemed as elusive as the peace that never came. Amid the destruction, the greatest enemy we now faced was the loss of purpose and the shadow of hopelessness that loomed over us. The days following the confrontation were a blur of despair and mourning. The war had transformed us, shattering us in ways I could never have imagined. Ryan was unrecognizable. The boy who had entered the war full of fear and confusion was now an empty shell, his eyes devoid of any spark of hope or purpose. He spent his days wandering the battlefield, picking through the remnants of lost memories and lives, desperately searching for something, anything, that could give meaning to his existence. Maria, once the tireless nurse, the anchor of compassion amid the chaos, was broken. The revelation of the futility of her efforts had devastated her. She continued to treat the wounded, but her gaze was distant, her connection with those she tried to save severed. Each life that slipped away in her hands felt like a personal blow, and she no longer had the strength to cry. It was as if the war had drained all her humanity, leaving only a moving body, a shadow of who she used to be. Ahmed, the rebel leader fighting for freedom and justice, was consumed by guilt and disillusionment. The truth about the manipulation by leaders had crushed him. He withdrew from his followers, unable to face those who had believed in his cause. The leadership he once carried with pride had become an unbearable burden. Ahmed isolated himself, living among the ruins, his mind in constant torment. He could not undo the choices he had made, the lives he had taken, and the reality that his struggle was part of a dirty game overwhelmed him. The war had revealed the worst in us. Human nature, with all its capacity for destruction and cruelty, had manifested in ways I had never thought possible. In the end, everything we fought for, everything we lost, seemed worthless. The futility of the war was clear, an endless cycle of violence and suffering fueled by lies and ambition. I reflected on how fragile our sanity was, how easily we could be manipulated to commit atrocities in the name of causes we didn't even understand. The relentless search for purpose in a chaotic world had led us to an abyss from which there was no return. One night, as the full moon illuminated the ruins around us, I saw Ryan sitting alone, his head bowed and shoulders slumped. Maria approached slowly and sat beside him, wordlessly. Ahmed, somehow drawn by the same melancholy moon, emerged from the shadows and joined them. I watched from a distance, feeling a mix of sadness and a tiny flicker of hope. The scene was one of tragic beauty. Three shattered souls, united by pain and shared experience, found a moment of quiet peace under the starry sky. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for redemption, a possibility of rebuilding lost humanity. Or maybe it was just a brief pause in the desolation, a moment of calm before we were once again